regions.
Hello and welcome, dear viewers, to Cases. I'm Farah Hatwi. More than 1.6 million Palestinians face the mercy of Egyptian officers at Rafah crossing. This is Gaza, where the cohesion of geography forced more than 1.6 million Palestinians to be captive by regional political agendas. In regular days, the number of people crossing Rafah borders reaches 1,200 daily, but as restrictions increase, the number dropped to 600. Nowadays, Rafah crossing is totally closed, since all attentions are focused on Egypt's political turmoil. What is the livelihood situation of Gazans in the absence of diesel fuel in the Strip? How can Gazans live? Do Gazans face a collective punishment? What would be the situation of Gazans if Egypt spills over into the civil war? Of course, we will be tackling more about this issue specifically with our guest here in the studio, Dr. Hussein Gharbiye, Professor of Political Science at Lebanese University, and with Mr. Mohammed Suleiman, a journalist and human rights worker in Gaza. Hello and welcome to Cases, Mr. Hussein. We will watch a report that would give us an insight of today's topic and be right back. Dear viewers, let's watch it together.
Every time Israel launches a war on the Gaza Strip, all attentions are focused on Rafah crossing, the only regular exit for the 1.6 million resident Gazans. Interestingly, Rafah crossing does not only connect Egypt with Gaza, it is also a connection with the outside world, as it has become the vital window for Gazans seeking to enter or leave the narrow strip. Nowadays, in light of Egypt's critical political phase, restrictions increased at Rafah crossing and Palestinians have been witnessing mistreatment from many Egyptian officers. And while the Sinai region witnesses lack of Egyptian central authority, restrictions at Rafah crossing remain in increase. Ghazi Hamad, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs in Gaza, stated, "We have recently noticed slowness in work at the Rafah border because of increased restrictions that caused a notable decrease in the number of travelers from the Gaza Strip." Indeed, any attempt to close or increase restrictions at Rafah crossing will result in severe implications for Gazans, including preventing access to healthcare medication, preventing access to opportunities for education and employment abroad, causing fatal damage to commerce and business, creating a growing feeling among Gazans that they are enclosed, isolated and trapped, and rising prices of goods and basic materials. Sadly, hundreds of Palestinians stuck every day at Rafah crossing under the heat of the sun since early morning, waiting the approval of Egyptian officers to cross the border. In fact, according to the international law, the condition of Palestinians at Rafah crossing is a severe violation of the freedom of movement. Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says, "Everyone lawful within the territory of a state shall within that territory have the right to liberty of movement and freedom to choose his residence. And everyone shall be free to leave any country, including his own." The covenant adds, "No one should arbitrarily be deprived of the right to enter his own country." In addition to the apartheid Israeli occupation, do Gazans nowadays suffer the consequences of internal Egyptian problems? What would happen to Gaza Strip if Egypt spills over into a civil war? Is Gaza dependent on Egypt? Does it share the same path and fate?
Okay, Mr. Hussein, if you can give some history here for the viewers. Since when did the Rafah crossing or the closure of Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt exist? Is it a new thing or it has been going on for a very long time?
In fact, the problem of Gaza started in 2005 when Israel declared the withdrawal of its troops from Gaza and declared Gaza independent entity, a political entity. So since then, in fact, Israel gave itself the free will to do whatever it wants to blockade the Gaza Strip on land and on sea. and in fact made Gaza as a large prison, kept all this over 1 million inhabitants deprived or under the mercy of the giving of Israel to basic human lives. So the problem started in 2005. Since then, things escalate and decrease measures of embargo on the Strip itself. So that's why we saw so many attempts by some countries to break the embargo or to force Israel to allow humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. So it never stopped. Regarding Egypt, things were going smoothly until the some militant attack on the Egyptian troops in Sinai. This, in fact, forced the authorities in Egypt to close the frontiers between Gaza and Egypt, which is, in my opinion, it's normal for any country to do that in order to protect its own interest and to protect its own troops until the problem has been solved.
Okay.
So
a question here goes for Mr. Mohammed Suleiman. Mr. Mohammed, you witnessed live the conditions of these Palestinians that are trying to cross Rafah crossing and enter into Egypt or vice versa, into Palestine or going into Egypt. What can you tell us today about the conditions that you've seen these Palestinians passing through?
Yes, I mean, it's first a completely terrible situation for Palestinians who want to travel through the Rafah crossing. I mean, on both sides of the Rafah border, whether on the Palestinian or the Egyptian side, the fact that there is only a very limited number of Palestinians who are allowed to travel on a daily basis. Compared to a population of 1.6 or 1.7 million Palestinians living in the besieged Gaza Strip, the Rafah border is the only avenue that is allowed for Palestinians to access the outside world. However, since, as you just explained, Gaza, since Hamas rose to power in 2006, 2007, Gaza has been isolated, and there was sort of a collective punishment imposed on the Palestinians by the Israeli occupation in collaboration with the former regime in Egypt, led by Hosni Mubarak. Now, things have not considerably changed now for Palestinians to travel. It's a very lengthy and bureaucratic process. I mean, when it's a very basic and simple human right for every Palestinian, for every human being, to be allowed freedom of movement for Palestinians, this is a very privileged right. Not everyone is actually allowed to travel and access the outside world. Only those with strong reasons to travel are allowed to travel through the Rafah crossing. Therefore, the case has been inverted. Everyone is banned from traveling.
Okay, but Mr. Mohammed, Mr. Mohammed, of course, as someone who's not only a journalist writing about the issue of what you've seen happening in the Rafah crossing, but also as a journalist here, in your opinion, for what reasons are these Palestinians subjected to this degrading treatment, as you named it, at the Rafah crossing, whether when they wanted to enter Egypt or going back to Gaza? What's the reason here? Is there, let me say, a legal idea or a legal decision taken by the Egyptian government itself to treat these Palestinians in this way, or is it an individual act by one of these officials found at the borders?
I mean, I wouldn't say it is an individual act. It has been a policy for years and years on end to treat Palestinians humiliatingly, not only on the Rafah crossing, but also inside Cairo International Airport when Palestinians, land in Cairo on their way back to the Gaza Strip. They also received humiliating treatment by Egyptian soldiers, by Egyptian border police and Egyptian soldiers. I mean, in order to explain this, one has to go into, intricate political debates and, the fact that Israel has to, for example, shoulder the primary responsibility for what is happening for the Palestinians. And that, for example, when Hamas rose to power, Israel sort of tried to push the Gaza Strip south towards Egypt in order to connect Palestinians with Egypt and to sort of throw this sort of burden that is the Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip onto Egypt. And therefore, Egypt tries to make it difficult for Palestinians to rely on them for their, daily lives, and for example, the tunnel economy. So now we are sort of dependent on Egypt for our economy, and also in terms of freedom of movement, we have become dependent on Egypt. When in fact, Israel, as an occupying power, has to take responsibility for the occupied Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip. For example, we keep talking about the Rafah crossing, and we forget the fact that towards the north of the Gaza Strip, there is the Erez crossing, which is completely shut, which is completely closed. Now, Israel, for example, is in complete violation of international law, is prohibiting Palestinians from accessing, for example, the West Bank and Israel and the outside world through the Erez crossing. But now, because Israel has succeeded in diverting attention from itself towards Egypt, we have focused on Egypt and forgot all about Israel. But again, that does not actually justify Israel's crime, the Egyptian ill treatment of the Palestinian travelers and passengers on the Egyptian border. Now, I cannot determine or precisely stand, or I cannot precisely say what the reasons why the Egyptian police, insist on this sort of degrading and humiliating treatment of the Palestinians. But again, I mean, it's a very wide and lengthy political debate that one has to go into in order to explain these reasons.
Okay, a question goes to you, Dr. Hussein Gharbi. The journalist Mohammed Suleiman, he wrote an article, of course, specifying what he saw at the Rafah crossing, because he was one of those that would like to pass through the Rafah border here. And he actually described the extreme conditions that these Palestinians are actually facing, whether it comes when submitting their passports or their visas, or even the area that they are waiting on in the terminal, in the Egypt Rafah terminal. Here my question goes to you, Doctor. Isn't that violating, aren't these actions that are happening at the Rafah crossing violating some important international laws and norms that the Egyptians already ratified?
Let's put it this way, and international law is clear. International law speaks about general ideas, not specific ones. Okay. When they say freedom of movement or crossing, this is in general. They say the people have the right to move freely from one place to another. But when it comes to implement such policies on the ground, the case differs and changes dramatically. Okay. Particularly in the case of cases of conflict between within the country itself or with this country and Gaza Strip. So particularly now we're concentrated on Egypt. But the problem is not only between Gaza and Egypt, it's between Gaza and Israel as well. Yes. So because of the turmoil that is going on in Egypt, certainly in any country they will have extreme measures to stop the influx of people from one place to another, particularly if there are some groups, militant groups, that are causing troubles.
Therefore, we're speaking of freedom of movement here.
Exactly, exactly. So it affects innocent people, it affects civilians. Yes. And this is the Geneva Convention clearly stated that we shouldn't have collective measures. Yes. That is, okay, you have a problem with certain groups, this shouldn't affect the innocent people. But when in a crisis, you cannot distinguish them because things get out of hand. They are in a crisis. The word organization doesn't exist, or it's a minimum state. So we always have victims, and usually the victims are these innocent civilians. This is the problem between the set of rules we have on international law and what's going on the ground. So we cannot say, okay, it's difficult to distinguish between the two, particularly that Egypt today is going through a hell of problems that cannot control its own security, let alone bringing maybe or exporting bad, what's called problems from outside its borders.
Okay, Mr. Mohammed, as a mere reflection of inhumane treatment, is the death of Ghada Al-Khawladi from Khan Yunis, who died a few months ago because she was unable to get out of Gaza for treatment. How come we haven't heard enough information or enough news about that idea or that scenario that took place over there? How come we haven't heard anything about that? And that's, of course, it's a mere reflection of an inhumane treatment that took place.
Yeah, I mean, it's really shameful that there is complete apathy towards the systematic and consistent human rights violations which are taking place in the Gaza Strip on a daily basis. I mean, the case that you just mentioned is just one example that gives an insight into the larger picture, into the wide scale of this sort of ill treatment and a grave, situation inside the Gaza Strip. I mean, it's very simple. The right, as your guest again pointed out, the right to freedom of movement is guaranteed by all international norms and standards. Now, when a Palestinian wants to travel, the case has become inverted. Every Palestinian is banned from traveling unless they have a reason to travel. So everyone inside the Gaza Strip is not now, as a person now, personally, I am not allowed to leave the Gaza Strip because there is no reason for me to travel. I do not have residency outside of the Gaza Strip.
Yes, you said something in your report that if these Palestinians lack the official documents that proves that they have a reasonable reason to pass and therefore they're not allowed to pass. What does that mean? What kind of official documents should these Palestinians acquire before they're allowed to pass to their country?
Yeah, I mean, it means, for example, unless you are a patient with strong necessity to leave the Gaza Strip and receive medical treatment in hospitals outside of the Gaza Strip. So you need to have and to provide sufficient documents that prove that you are a patient. If you're a student who studies at a university outside of the Gaza Strip, so you need to provide documents that prove. I mean, even in such cases, in extreme situations, even those patients, like the example that you just mentioned, and even some students lose their scholarships. For example, now the Rafah crossing has been closed for the 4th day in a row. And everyone, including patients and students, are not allowed to travel, are not allowed to leave the Gaza Strip. And those who come from abroad, from, for example, Europe or Malaysia or outside countries, when they land in Cairo, they get deported back to where they come from because they're not allowed to enter the Egyptian territories. And they're not allowed to come to the Rafah crossing because it's closed. So if you notice, like the fact that the situation is volatile in Egypt.
So these rules, that means that these rules are not applied only on Palestinians, but even on people from different nationalities that are trying to cross Rafah crossing?
Just on Palestinians. No, just on Palestinians.
Just on Palestinians.
There have been many letters sent by the Egyptian border police and by the Egyptian ministries to airports not to allow any Palestinian to board planes heading to Cairo because the Rafah crossing is closed. So when Palestinians land in Cairo, even they get deported back to the countries. I have 2 friends who were deported just yesterday back to where they come from Malaysia. They were on their way back home to Gaza, but because the Rafah crossing is closed, they were not allowed to land in Cairo and come to Gaza. So they're not even allowed to come back home.
Okay, we will take a first break. Today's episode, dear viewers, stay with us.
Beyond the lines, beyond the surface. Depth, clarity, substance. Beyond the discourse.
Beyond politics, beyond the shallowness of everyday politics.
Dear viewers, welcome back. Ghazi Hamad, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Hamas government, stated that the number of people crossing Rafah borders was almost 1,200 daily, but it had dropped to between 600 and 650 over the last weeks due to the severe Egyptian restrictions. After the Oslo Accords in 1994, Rafah crossing began to serve as a terminal for the import of goods as well, and every month hundreds of trucks enter the strip through it. According to official resources, more than 70% of the population currently receives humanitarian aid. Of course, here, Ms. Dr. Hussein, these are facts that are happening throughout Palestine, even especially in the Rafah crossing. How important is Rafah crossing for both Gaza and Egypt, if we can say?
Egypt is the passage of the Gazans to go to the outside world today.
Yes.
It's the only place. Israel is very well known for its strict measures against the Palestinians. They broke every international law regarding the humanitarian issues. So the only place left for the Gazans is through Egypt.
Yes.
So Egypt.
And that's the only exit.
Exactly. And the sea is controlled by Israel. So there isn't any freedom to go outside of Gaza from the sea.
Okay.
So the only place left is the borders with the Sinai borders with Syria with Egypt. So it's essential for the Palestinians in Gaza to go through Egypt to go to outside world. So they are stuck. There's no other way for them to move to outside world unless they go through the Egyptian borders. Now, what's going on in Egypt certainly affected this case and caused so many tragedies for the Palestinians in larger scale issues, in larger scale food-wise, medicine, education, all sorts of
necessary medical treatment.
all sorts of things have been affected greatly by the embargo, or not embargo, I'm not saying embargo, because there's no embargo here. It is only security measures by the Egyptian government for a short period of time. For how long it lasts, nobody knows. It's all depends on what's going on in Egypt today.
Okay. Mr. Mohammed Suleiman, the angry people that you've seen at the Rafah crossing, including patients, businessmen, children, students waiting at the borders, did they have any intention of protesting, filing a suit, or even complaining to human rights organizations around the world of this deteriorating condition that they've been through, at least of what you've seen while writing the article?
No, I'm not actually aware of any cases of Palestinians filing complaints at human rights organizations against the ill treatment of the Egyptian soldier. I mean, for a Palestinian, even to speak out against the ill treatment at the Rafah crossing is actually, an improbable scenario, because for them, again, the Rafah crossing is the only way for them to access the outside world. And if they actually get their names on the blacklist, because I mentioned in my article that there is a list. Some people get blacklisted, and then they get eternally banned from leaving the Gaza Strip. Just imagine this horrible scenario of a Palestinian trapped in the Gaza Strip, not even allowed to, when they have a reason to travel, they just get back. They're not allowed because they have their names on the blacklist by the Egyptian intelligence. But, normally young people my age, from 18 until 40 years, normally they do not cross the Egyptian terminal without first, being interviewed by the Egyptian intelligence. There is what we call security interview. So the Egyptian intelligence interviews us for 5 minutes and asks us about the reasons why we're traveling, to show our documents and to prove that, we're not there to infiltrate or to illegally inside Egypt. So, it's a very problematic situation. I mean, Palestinians have to be cautious about it. And for them, it doesn't matter the ill treatment of the Egyptian soldiers. What matters is that they want to eventually, cross. They want to eventually be able to leave the Gaza Strip. So even if they get ill treatment, even if they get humiliated, it doesn't matter. What matters is the end. If they
Mr. Mohammed, how beneficial do you believe your reports are, or these reports that are issued on the behalf of the suffering of these Palestinians at Rafah crossing today?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word.
How beneficial will these articles and these documents and these information coming from live witnesses such as what happened with you, important worldwide, let me say, how important are they and how beneficial can it be? What can it change on the ground?
Are you asking about the possibility of things changing?
No, about your article, the article that you actually wrote. How important is it?
I don't think it's going to change anything. No, I don't think it's going to have that wide impact, even if it gets widely circulated. I mean, this is not.
Wouldn't it grab the attention of human rights organizations at least?
No, I don't. I mean, this is a very well-known issue for everyone who's interested in the Gaza Strip and
Yes.
in the Palestinian territory. It's not that this is sort of a groundbreaking work that people for the first time come to know about. The
Yes,
fact
because
that
you described some
Palestinians
humiliation that is ill-equipped, has no proper facilities, lacks drinkable water, toilets are filthy, microphones are not used, and this, you spoke exactly in depth about what's happening inside the Egyptian Rafah terminal, and that by itself should be grabbing the attention of human rights organizations around the world, at least to like file suits against.
I mean, to some extent.
Okay.
But still, I mean, it's not that simple to change politics on this. I mean, this is again a very deeply complicated political issue. I mean, you cannot, for example, easily ask Egyptians to, make things easy for Palestinians to travel in and out of the Gaza Strip. When on the other side, again, Israel has to be involved in this. Israel has to take responsibility for the Palestinians as well. So, I mean, it's unacceptable what's happening, but again, it's not easy to change things, and the Egyptians will have an argument to justify, their acts on the Egyptian border.
Mr. Mohammed Suleiman, journalist and human rights worker in Gaza, thank you very much for joining us in Cases. A question that I asked, of course, to Mr. Mohammed, Dr. Hussein here. Mohammed actually highlighted the extreme conditions that I just explained, and how these officials or the Egyptian personnel are treating those Palestinians that are willing to pass into Gaza. Even they are saying that if you don't have reasonable reason, you're not allowed to pass in or even to come in. Here, how can you view this today? Is it a kind of a higher authority that they are practicing, or that's an individual act that the Egyptian personnel are making?
Let's put it this way. I mean, to move from one place to another between countries, you have to have certain reasons to move.
Yes.
You cannot just put yourself on a plane and go to a country in Europe. You have to have
So can we say that Egypt has the legal right to actually
definitely
investigate?
I mean, sure, definitely. This is security measures for every country to pursue and to implement. So it's not easy, or it's not as simple as just I want to leave the country to go to another one without any restrictions. No, it doesn't work like that. I mean, even though international law doesn't say that.
Yes.
International law doesn't say that. Yes.
Okay, doctor, but at least they should provide the essential factors. I mean, here, according to Mohammed and his own analysis, while he's waiting in the terminal, in the Egypt Rafah terminal, he said that there is ill-equipped, it has no proper facilities, it lacks drinkable water, and of course we all know the temperature over there. Toilets are filthy, no microphones used when calling names, so therefore the Palestinians should come closer to the steps and listen if their names have been called. Do you think it's a deliberate intention here to humiliate Palestinians? Or if I can say, all Egypt, most places in Egypt are like that? Because, of course, we're talking about a poor communities and poor society.
In general, from my personal experience, when you move from one country to another in the Arab world, in general, you don't have such proper facilities. Only rarely you find it in some wealthy countries or some decent countries who can provide good service to travelers. But in general, in the Arab world...
So it's not a deliberate intention. Egypt, most of it is like that.
Deliberate actions is when they put some restrictions on the movement itself, but not to provide, in the case of providing facilities to drinking water or humanitarian, such humanitarian issues. This is different. But when you restrict the movement, not only the movement, but to implement pressure on the people to stop them from thinking of going to Egypt, this is deliberate action. But providing humanitarian services, no, this is not a deliberate. This is, in fact, a condition on the border by some Arab countries who have poor... In Lebanon, go to the border with Syria and the Masna. You don't have even public toilets there. So it's not the case of deliberate actions. We do have these things around the Arab world in general. As I said, some countries who are wealthy enough or consider the meaning of human life itself, they do have some humanitarian measures to ease the need of people when they want to do when they travel. In Europe, all these facilities are there for travelers. They can. It's a pleasure. It's a fun for them to travel from one place to another. But in our Arab countries in general, it's a hell to go from one place to another.
Definitely.
When you cross borders,
Okay.
it takes you hours and hours waiting for documents to
Mr.
finish.
Mkhaymer Abu Saada will join us also through the phone. Mr. Mkhaymer Abu Saada, hello and welcome to KSN. Of course, I do remind our viewers, he is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Al-Azhar University in Gaza. Hello and welcome, Mr. Mkhaymer.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mkhaymer, can we say that the unstable political relationship between Egypt and Hamas specifically is what is controlling Rafah crossing?
Well, the issue of the Palestinian suffering at border crossings doesn't have to do only with the tense relationship between Hamas and the new regime in Egypt. The Palestinians have been subjected to bad treatment on border crossings, whether with Israeli border crossings or at the Rafah border crossings for many years. Since the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip in the summer of 2007, Israel and the international community imposed siege and blockade against 1.7 million Palestinians who live in Gaza, which also made the humanitarian situation much more severe here. As a result of the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip, the Rafah border crossing became the only border crossing between Gaza and the outside world as a result of the Israeli closure of all other border crossings between Gaza and Israel. And when Mubarak was in control of Egypt, the Rafah border crossing was closed down for many years, and it was only open for humanitarian cases, case by case. After the Egyptian revolution...
Okay, but Dr. Mkhaymer, today who controls the opening and the closure of Rafah crossing? Are we speaking about the Egyptian government who controls the Rafah crossing, or is it the Israelis that obliges the Egyptian government when to open it and when to close it? Who is controlling it now?
Now, my understanding, Israel doesn't have any control over Rafah border crossing at this moment. This is a border crossing completely between Gaza and Egypt. There is no Israeli presence and no Israeli control over the crossing. But there was an agreement signed between the PA and Israel in November of 2005, which allowed for the crossing to operate. But the Egyptians are basically treating with this border crossing as an Egyptian sovereign area, and due to instability and security chaos in Sinai after the ouster of Morsi from the presidency, the border crossing has been closed down for the past 4 days as a result of the insecurity and instability in Egypt and mainly in Sinai at this moment.
Okay, so it's obviously every time there is an unstable dilemma inside within Egypt, the Palestinians pay the price, as what happened lately.
Yes,
okay. And that's the collective punishment that we're speaking about.
Years. Let me just remind you that when the Egyptian border police were attacked last August and 16 members of the Egyptian border police were murdered, the border crossing was closed for about 10 days, which caused a lot of humanitarian problems for the 1.7 million Palestinians.
Okay.
Also, 2 months ago, when 6 Egyptian soldiers were kidnapped, the border crossing between Gaza and Egypt was closed down, and now it's been closed for the 4th day. So anytime there are political instability in Egypt or Sinai, the Palestinians in Gaza have to suffer as a result of that.
Okay. Dr. Mkhaymer Abu Saada, Associate Professor of Political Science at Al-Azhar University, joining us from Gaza. Thank you for being with us.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Dear viewers, a final break and we'll be right back.
Time. Variable. Event. The only constant variable in life is change. broader perspective. Arguments and counter-arguments on our platform.
Global Insights. The Globe on our platform.
Dear viewers, welcome back. Doctor, isn't Egypt also considered violating Article 27 and Article 33 of the First Geneva Convention on the protection of victims on international armed conflicts when not allowing civilians in Gaza passage to seek a refugee and humanitarian treatment?
In theory, yes, it is breaching such international law. But as I said, every country is dictated, or its political action is dictated by its political stability or instability. So in Egypt, definitely today, it's an unstable country, so we have unstable measures. Yes, under the Mubarak regime, for instance, when the country was stable, we witnessed a breach of international law when they closed the borders for sometimes in coordination with the Israeli government to put pressure on Hamas to follow some certain rules or certain policies. Then, yes, it was a breach of international law. But today, the case is different. Egypt today is going through turmoil, it's going through unstable situation there.
Yes.
So they have to take unstable or a different set of policies in order to protect or to limit the disturbances that is taking place within Egypt and to stop the disturbances coming from outside Egypt. Definitely, or specifically, that there are some skirmishes or some security problems between Hamas or the Jihadiyin from Gaza and the Egyptian forces. So in this case, no, there is no such breach. Although the Geneva Convention says we have to distinguish between those who are causing the troubles or the problems and the innocent people. But as I said, in crisis, in time of crisis, it's difficult to distinguish between them. You always have to have victims here.
Okay, and then a question comes to mind here. Then, in what case does Egypt have a legal right, I'm saying, to close the crossing completely?
Every country has the legal right to close the...
for what conditions, Doctor?
For security,
safety reasons?
For safety reasons, definitely. And this is...
Okay, but if this happens, aren't they supposed to have a substitute, for example? Because I do know that there are various exits rather than Rafah crossing that Palestinians can use, but under certain conditions and exceptional circumstances. Here, aren't they supposed, the Egyptians, in case they want to close Rafah crossing, to have a substitute for these Palestinians? Because as we've highlighted, we've got Palestinian patients who are in excessive need inside Gaza for medical treatment, and the only place that they can receive it is from Egypt. Let's
be fair here. I don't want to put or to blame the Egyptian policymakers for what's happening to Gaza.
Yes.
Gaza Strip is bordered by two countries, Egypt and Israel.
Yes.
Why doesn't Israel ease the need for the Gazans or Palestinians to have medical aid, for instance, or to ease the suffering of the Palestinian people? Israel is happy for what's happening to them. Yes. It's not helping in any way.
Of course, and we're talking about the collaboration between the Israelis and the Egyptians on the Palestinians, of
but
course.
Not at this stage. Not at this stage.
Not at this stage.
Not at this stage, no. Of course, there is suffering now in Gaza, but Israel is not doing anything in order to help these people at all. In fact, it's happy for what's...
If we lost hope in Israel, we will give some attention to the Egyptians, how they can help in that.
In Egypt, they have a ground for the security measures they have in now, but Israel doesn't have any. And by the way, throughout the blockade that Israel had over Gaza, it's ironic. All the countries that support Israel criticized Israel for its policies and the breaching of international law regarding the humanitarian issues for the Palestinians, but they did nothing to force Israel to ease the problem on the Palestinians. This is, I'm saying, all the friends of Israel criticized and condemned the Israeli policies that was pursued by the Israeli government towards the Palestinians, but nothing happened. And the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, Tony Blair, Cameron, even Carter, Hillary Clinton, All of them criticized.
Yes, and here
but nothing happened.
Almost a couple of years ago, dozens of Arab organizations and international organizations issued an urgent call for the permanent opening of Rafah crossing, and the calls were supported by veteran, anti-apartheid, UN reporter, activists around the globe, but we haven't seen vital actions on the ground.
Well, you cannot force a policy or a demand of external factors on a sovereign state like Egypt.
Yes.
Egypt decides whether to open it or not. Nobody can force Egypt to open its borders with Gaza. On what ground? We're talking about sovereign countries.
Yes.
Non-interference between and the internal policies of any country. So why do you assume that the border should be open on humanitarian issues? Okay, there's suffering. There's an issue here. But the Gaza issue is linked to the Middle East issue. It's not Gaza and Egypt. It's linked to a larger issue.
Yes, it's because Egypt is the only way for the Palestinians, or the only air for the Palestinians.
Yes, so you cannot, because it is the only way, our passage to the Palestinians, you have to have good rapport with the Egyptian government in order to ease the situation. You cannot force policies over the Egyptian government. No, you cannot. Then it will have a reaction, a bad reaction to this imposing of policies or demands. Then the Egyptian will take they will have counterattack. Maybe they will increase the suffering of the Palestinians by having strict measures over crossing of people between Gaza and Egypt.
We are joined by Dr. Mohsen Abu Ramadan, an economic analyst. Thank you for joining us in Cases. Dr. Mohsen, we lost the line with Dr. Mohsen. Of course, we wanted to ask about the economic perspective and how Gaza is benefiting if Rafah crossing is to be opened, of course, and that led to the existence of tunnels inside between Rafah and between Egypt and Gaza. We also heard state-run Egyptian magazines claiming that Hamas members were responsible, Doctor, for the deadly attack that killed around 16 Egyptian border guards near Rafah. To what extent will such accusations affect Egypt-Palestinian relationship and eventually Rafah? Because at one point or another we've seen how the Egyptian governments, whether through Hosni Mubarak or Mohammed Morsi, leaning towards Israelis' wills and Israelis' commands rather than what Hamas wants, or rather what the Gazans want.
Yes, the issue here is very complicated now because it involves so many factors within each country.
Yes.
Egypt, Gaza and Israel. We don't have stable political systems in the Arab world today, particularly within the so-called Palestinian state, Gaza and the West Bank. Even within the Palestinian state, there's the division between Gaza and West Bank, between Abu Mazen and Hamas. So it's not stable between the Palestinians themselves, let alone have a stable relationship between Gaza and Egypt. So there's huge differences between the two sides here, between Hamas and the Egyptian government. Particularly that Hamas was accused of attacking the Egyptian soldiers, yes, the army. Or if Hamas wasn't to be blamed, maybe some other Palestinians. Still, the issue is Palestinians versus Egyptian troops. So security measures has to have an effect, and it has to have burdens on the Palestinians for such security measures.
Okay, we're back to Dr. Mohsen Abu Ramadan, an economic analyst. Hello and welcome to Cases, Dr. Mohsen.
Welcome.
How economically important is the Rafah crossing for the Gazans, Doctor?
Since the closure imposed by the Israeli government mid of 2007, the economy in Gaza depends on directly to the tunnels, and all the commodities and goods coming from these tunnels, around 70% from the needs of the Gaza market depend on these tunnels.
Speaking about the tunnels, Dr. Mohsen,
procedures from Egyptian army in order to close these tunnels, which affect negatively the quantity of this amount to the market.
Okay, but Dr.
especially
Mohsen, speaking about
the lack
these
of,
tunnels, do you
fuel.
believe that they are a subsequent reaction to closing of Rafah?
Sorry?
Mr. Dr. Mohsen, I'm saying that these tunnels that you're speaking about, which played an essential role in boosting the economy inside Gaza, are they a subsequent reaction? Excuse me?
Rafah border between Gaza and Egypt.
Yes.
There is a tunnel since 2007 because of the closure and the siege imposed by the Israeli government to the Gaza. Now the Palestinians in Gaza, they depend around 70% from this amount of goods and commodities coming through these tunnels. I mean Egyptian product.
Of course, Dr. Hussein, these tunnels, of course, located on the Egypt-Gaza borders that are used by Palestinians to transport goods and all these important factors, of course, can we say that they are a result of because, of course, they are used, excessive force is used upon the users of these tunnels, and they're being closed and shut down by Egyptians specifically. But here, if these tunnels are shut down, and if the Rafah crossing and the Rafah border is shut down, then what will happen to the economy inside Gaza?
The issue of tunnels is it's very important, tragic even, and funny at the same time.
Okay.
When they say Egyptian authorities closed the borders with Gaza, yet we have tunnels between Gaza and Sinai.
Yes.
Do you think the authorities in Egypt don't know about these tunnels and who controls them? Definitely they know. I mean, under Hosni Mubarak, these tunnels flourished. And by the Egyptian authorities themselves who allow these tunnels to exist. Otherwise, they would have demolished it or destroyed it. So Egypt was playing two roles here. Close the borders with Gaza for certain reasons to please the Israelis because they have agreement between Israel and Egypt for some security measures. But at the same time, Egypt through the back door, allow the Palestinians to dig these tunnels and to move between the two countries, Gaza and Egypt. So the tunnels were the lifeline of the Palestinians for movement of goods and products. And I read an article only not a few weeks back. In fact, the Palestinians were buying Kentucky Fried Chickens from Sinai through the tunnels. When I read that, I was burst laughing. So even because
that's a result of the extreme conditions that they are living.
It's a luxury to import Kentucky Fried Chicken to go to Gaza. So it means
that's how easy it is now. It has become, of course, because and we say again, it's the only way out for them. Dr. Mohsen Abu Ramadan, what would happen if the Rafah crossing is to be opened permanently? How will that affect the economy inside Gaza?
I want to clarify certain points.
Yes.
First of all, most of the Palestinians, especially civil society organizations, they are blaming Israeli government, and we consider the main enemy for us is Israeli occupation and the siege, which is collective punishment, which create consequences for all the living condition and create a humanitarian crisis. So the tunnel, it was an alternative because of the closure. But the people in Gaza, they prefer to have strong ties between Gaza and West Bank, implementing the international human rights law and implementing the international law, which calls that there is one unit between West Bank and Gaza as a land which was occupied in 1967.
Yes. So
we consider this tunnel as alternative temporary, but for the mid-term or short-term, we are focusing to have our right for not just easing the siege, lifting totally the siege, and have strong infrastructure, economic infrastructure between the Palestinian in Gaza and West Bank. So the main focus for us, not about the tunnels. You know, as mentioned by my colleague now, when he answered, there is something between security needs and humanitarian needs.
Okay,
now, the human rights organization raised an appeal asking Egyptian government to take in their consideration the humanitarian needs. But politically and legal dimension and economic dimension, we are blaming Israeli occupation, and we consider that he is the main cause of the humanitarian crisis which we are living nowadays.
Okay, Dr. Mohsen Abu Ramadan, economic analyst, thank you for joining us in Cases. Dr. Hussein Gharbi, unfortunately our time is up, and we do wish that this ongoing crisis inside Egypt will not affect the Palestinians more than it's affecting it right now. Thank you very much for joining us in Cases. Of course, Dr. Hussein Gharbi, Professor of International Relations in the Faculty of Law and Political Science at the Lebanese University. Thank you very much for joining us in Cases. Dear viewers, whenever those are persecuted, that place we tackle case by case. Thank you for watching.